Hello and welcome to this webinar delivered by the ISM Trust. I am Maria Visitiu and I'm Operations and Events Officer at the ISM, and today I am joined by Geraldine, Peterson and Gillian McCall, Specialist Immigration Barristers from Richmond Chambers, who will take us through the immigration routes for creative artists coming to the UK. Before we begin, we have a few points for you. You should be able to see us, and you'll see a PowerPoint presentation displayed on your screen in a couple of moments. You should also be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. So if you experience any technical difficulties, such as sound quality issues, please let us know in the chat box and we'll make attempts to resolve the issue. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on our website at ism.org/webinars. There will also be an opportunity to answer some questions at the end of the presentation, so if you can think of any questions during the webinar, please let us know in the questions box and we'll attempt to answer as many of them as possible at the end. Now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Geraldine and Gillian for the presentations. Thank you.
I'm going to begin the presentation today, and while we're waiting for the PowerPoint to come up on screen, just to let you know a little bit about the format for the webinar. I am going to speak to you about short-term routes, which are primarily the visit visa routes. And as soon as Maria has sorted out the screen, I'll begin. And after, I'm going to be handing over, after my presentation, to my colleague Gillian, who is going to take you through the longer term routes for creatives. So next slide, please. That familiar phrase. You'll see in front of you now a flow chart. Now, after the webinar is over, they are going to make available to you, the ISM are going to make available handouts which will have this chart. So it's not something you'll have to memorize, but I just want you to take it in a little bit at this point. It's a series of questions when you have a creative artist who wants to come to the UK that you will need to ask in order to know what routes will be available. And you'll see that on the right-hand side, we'll be talking about shorter term visits to the UK, and on the left-hand side, some of the longer terms. And again, as I say, you'll be able to follow this in the handout materials, which will be available after the webinar. And if we could have the next slide, please. Here's the first question. In the eyes of the Home Office, who is a creative artist? Next slide, please. And you'll see that this is from the guidance published by the Home Office, that actually it's a very, very wide remit. It's a very wide description. So it's photographers, you'll see. I don't need to read this out to you, but it's just about everyone that you and I might think of might be an artist. Next slide, please. But it also will include the people that are so important to a performance who aren't actually performing themselves. So the stage managers, the makeup artists, and all the other people that might be involved in a creative endeavor. Next slide, please. Now, major question. What is the artist's nationality? Now, there's a particular reason for this, which we'll see as we go along on the next slide. And that is because there are two categories of nationals in this context of nationality. And there are nationalities who need a visa before they come to the UK, or those who can arrive at the border, they still get a visa, as it were, or permission to enter, but they don't need to have organized a visa before they come. And the distinction is known as a visa national or a non-visa national. Now, with the materials, I've included a list of the countries where artists may come from that will need a visa. And we've come to realize since the end of December that EU nationals will join the list of those who don't need visas before coming to the UK. And they join countries like the US and so on. Well, everyone that, that isn't on that list of visa nationals. Next slide, please. Now, many of you may have questions about what happens to EU nationals coming to work in the UK as creative artists, musicians in this context. Next slide. And as I've already said to you, they're joining the list of countries that don't need visas. Now, those of us involved in immigration will look at this and say, this is just like everyone else, because you can continue to visit the UK for up to 6 months. But the particular guidance now for EU nationals on the government websites, which say precisely what has applied to everyone else, which is that as a visitor, you can come for up to 6 months, and there are various activities which you'll be permitted to do as a visitor, and the EU nationals have joined that. Next slide, please. So there's our first question. Is the artist a visa national or a non-visa national? If they're a visa national, you have to prepare the application and the paperwork beforehand and get issued a visa to come. If they're a non-visa national, what we say is you need to prepare your paperwork anyway. And we'll come to that a little bit later on, exactly what sort of paperwork is needed. Next slide. Next question to be asked in respect of this engagement and this artist. Will there be payment? Next slide. So if it's an unpaid engagement, then a visiting creative should be able to enter in on a standard visit visa. And visitors may be paid for their engagements on a short paid engagement. And this is something that's called a permitted paid engagement. Now, we used to refer to them as PPEs, but that's come to mean something else in this climate. Next slide, please. So next question to be asked, is the creative artist to be paid? And following from that, the question is, how long will the engagement be, the unpaid engagement? And if it's up to 6 months, then that is a suitable route to take. But if it's more than 6 months, well, unfortunately, this sort of visa isn't going to work for that. Next slide, please. Now let's have a look at the permitted activities on a standard visit visa, which generally means unpaid. Next slide. It's quite a wide remit again. This is right from the immigration rules, and it says that a creative visitor may give performances, do auditions, competitions, personal appearances, and take part in festivals. And there are certain festivals that they can come in as a standard visitor and be paid for. And that is the permit-free festivals. And we'll come to that a little bit later. And I've also in the materials given links to the permit-free festival list. And it's an exhaustive list. And amongst those festivals are very, very well-known ones, Glastonbury, Aldborough, those sorts of festivals. But we'll come to that a little bit later. And again, it says that standard visitors, personal or technical staff can come in. You'll also see that film crews that are being paid overseas can come in as well. Next slide, please. So you'll have seen from the chart that the duration of the stay is also important. And if it's an engagement, an unpaid engagement for more than, next slide please, more than 6 months, then it's not suitable, but generally up to 6 months. Now, what we've said about these sorts of visas is that non-visa nationals may come in using the e-gates, just waving their passports and so on. But we say at any given time, you should have the material with you, the documents with you that you may need to show about what you're about to do in the UK, so you could show an immigration officer that what you're about to do is a permitted activity. Visa nationals will have all that with them already because they'll have applied for their visa beforehand. Next slide, please. So again, as I've said, if it's not paid and more than 6 months, you need to find an alternative. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about the PPEs, the paid engagements. Next slide. So again, to look at the duration, you wouldn't get entry on a permitted paid engagement for an engagement that's more than 1 month. And Gillian will be speaking to you about engagements that what sort of visas you will need if the engagement is to be more than 1 month. And again, we'll come to what paperwork is required to show in order to gain entry for a permitted paid engagement. Next slide, please. So the categories for what you can do on a permitted paid engagement are much the same sorts of activities, except you're going to be paid. But the critical thing is the evidence that you will need to show. And you'll see that the engagement must be arranged before you come to the UK. You can't arrive and then apply for one. This is something that you've been engaged outside the UK. And it's declared as part of the application for entry clearance. Now, when they're talking about applications for entry clearance, again, that's our visa nationals. The non-visa nationals will be asking for permission to enter the UK to do that when they come to the border. So formal invitations, and we'll come to this later. Evidence should be there of the applicant's bona fides, like what sort of standing do they have as a creative artist, and how is this engaged in overseas? And you'll see the sorts of permitted paid engagements, and that's pretty wide and just about everything an artist might be seeking to do in the UK. Next slide. So again, duration of stay for a permitted paid engagement. Next slide. You'll see that entry will be granted for up to 1 month. And what we say is entry by e-gate, in other words, swanning in because you know you can do this because it's less than 1 month. This is not something you should do, again, because you have to be given permission to engage in this activity. So you'll, even if you're a non-visa national, you're going to have to stop by the border officials with all your paperwork to gain entry to come in and do this engagement. Next slide, please. Now, I referred to before the permit-free festivals. And the next slide is going to show you what you need to do if you want to add your festival to this exhaustive list. And you'll see the link at the top. That's where you can find out what festivals there are. And here is the criteria for inclusion for your festival on the permit-free festival list. It's quite onerous. Established for at least 3 years. You'll see the audience levels. There's references here to non-European nationals and how many you've used in your festival over the last few years. This clearly hasn't been changed since the end of December, but it's looking for an international flavor, I think, is really what we can say. Next slide, please. So if you're coming in for a permit-free festival, you'll need to show certain paperwork, and we referred to that before. It's your invitation and so on, but you may be paid for this sort of visit. Next slide. Now, here's the important question of what documentation you need. Next slide. And what you'll have to present either with your visa application or when you come in at the border. Next slide. Now, all visitors to the UK must provide evidence of these things, that you're going to leave at the end of your visit, you're not intending to live here through frequent visits, you're able to pay your expenses while you're here, and you've got a ticket home, and you have proof of what activities you want to do in the UK. And even if you weren't a creative artist seeking to come to the UK for this, you would be seeking to prove this to the immigration officer that you came in. And basically, you're going to do what you say you're going to do, and you're going to leave at the end of your visit without causing too much harm and having paid your expenses. Not causing any harm at all, I hope. Next slide, please. So the sorts of paperwork, the documentation that you would need to provide, I say splits into three different categories. First of all, you have the paperwork, which is to do with the activity. So it'll be your invitation, your contracts, and everything that is to do with the engagement itself, be it paid or unpaid, to do with the organization. And the next lot of paperwork is about the artists themselves, their home circumstances, their own finances. And this is all about, if we say that the engagement paperwork is about the activity, the personal paperwork that needs to be provided is all about whether you'll go home at the end of the visit. And finally, there's a third category, is how are you going to meet your expenses in the UK? And if the artist is going to pay for them themselves, then their personal financial circumstances may well need to be evidenced. If they're being paid by the third party, in other words, if accommodation or per diems or those sorts of things are going to be provided, then that will relate to the paperwork provided in respect of the engagements. Next slide, please. Now, the Home Office has really bumped up their website with regard to what evidence people need to show. And again, you'll see that at the beginning of this, from the Home Office website, you have to show evidence of your activities, that you'll leave at the end, and that you're able to support yourself and you've got a ticket home. And so they say you must provide your travel document. And then that middle category that we saw on the flow chart, your personal circumstances. And this fleshes out a bit more why they want to see that. Next slide, please. And again, it can be quite detailed, the personal circumstances you need to evidence. And you'll see here a list of the kinds of evidence that maybe that the Home Office would like to see. And, you know, headed note paper and headed note paper about any, say you're visiting from an orchestra abroad, then they like to see bona fide paperwork from that orchestra abroad, etc. But that gives you an indication, and I'm not going to read it out because you'll have that there in the materials if you download them after the webinar. Now, if you've got a sponsor, this is all about per diems and what accommodation will be provided. And again, that would be in the paperwork that you provide about the engagement itself. Next slide, please. And again, the paperwork they might like to see from a creative visitor. This is what they would need to see from permit-free festivals at the top, and what sort of evidence they would want to see from the engagement side of things. And obviously for creatives, they would like to see, if you're coming in to do a permitted paid engagement, when this is going to be. They also say about the personal bona fide of the creative artist, and you'll hear a bit more from Gillian about this, artists proving their standing. In other words, any awards you've received, any reviews, that sort of things you might like to include, just to show that you are a proper musician or performer. Next slide, please. Expenses, I'm not going to read this out, but if someone else is providing expenses for you, you have to think about whether or not it's a disguised payment. So what they say about per diems and so on is that they should be reasonable. And it shouldn't, if it's not a permitted paid engagement, it shouldn't be so large that it's, even though you're calling it expenses, it's clearly a payment. So that's the thing to pay attention to there. Next slide, please. Now, I want to talk about frequency of visits. Next slide. In fact, there is no rule, and people have this in their heads. You can only spend X amount of days in any 1 year. That's not so, but it's a little bit more nuanced. There's a little bit more discretion there. And what the Home Office don't want to see is someone who's here so frequently as a visitor that they more or less are living here. And let's have a look in the next slide at the sort of criteria that they'll be applying to frequent visitors. So here you have all the things, you know, have you put your kids in school here? Have you registered with a GP? That sort of thing. This is right from the Home Office website, which shows you what kinds of things they'll be having a look at. But I mean, if you make a good case in your paperwork for why you have been here frequently, that it's part of promoting an album, so you're needing to come to attend to various publicity events and so on. So just be aware that the Home Office, although there are no hard and fast rules, the nuanced way to look at it is whether or not you're actually seeking to make your home here. Next slide, please. So I've more or less talked you through, if you like, the right-hand side of this chart, which is about all the visits, the sorts of visits, paid and unpaid, and which nationalities need to apply beforehand and which don't, and the ideas of paperwork that you might need. And for the left-hand side of the chart, Gillian is going to be taking you through that. Next slide, please. So another question here, or the last question, if you like. In what circumstances would you need a sponsor's license? And a lot of people have this in their minds. And it's for paid engagements for longer than 1 month, if you have that in mind. And so therefore, at this point, a very good point to hand you over into the capable hands of my colleague, Gillian. Next slide. And you'll see she'll take you through the left-hand side. And the title of her presentation, next slide, is this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry. I think Maria is going to open my presentation so that we can start that. But as Jerry said, I'm going to talk about the main categories for long-term migration to the UK. I've called it longer term, but actually These categories could also be used by someone who is coming just for short term, but is maybe coming frequently and doesn't want to make an application every time that they're coming in, doesn't want to speak to immigration officers at the border. So they just want to get a long-term category that lets them come and go with a bit more flexibility. So Maria, if you could just move to the next slide. So the main categories I'm going to talk about are global talent, skilled worker, and temporary worker. These are likely to be the most relevant categories for people watching this presentation, but it's always worth having a good overview of someone's circumstances, because there might be a better route for an individual. If you're a musician that happens to be married to a British citizen, then coming on the basis of your relationship may well be the best option for you. If you're a very, very successful musician and you have £2 million in the bank, then coming as an investor is an option. I've also had musicians who have started music schools in the UK or other music related companies through startup and some of the business categories. So for today, these are the three I'm going to discuss, but just bear in mind that there are other options as well. So if we go to the next slide, please. The first one is global talent. And as a bit of a spoiler, this is going to be the best category for anyone that can meet the requirements. This is the category that's going to work best for the vast majority of people. For the individual, it gives them the most flexibility. For employers, it gives them a bit more freedom because they don't need to sponsor people. And for lawyers, it's also fun because we get to tell people that they're very talented, which doesn't come up a lot in our line of work. So on this side, you can see there are different endorsing bodies that can confirm someone's talent in particular fields. So for musicians, it's very likely to be that the best category is the best endorser is the Arts Council. But I have previously had people who have perhaps done academic studies in music history or music theory, and so they might have the option to apply for humanities as well as to the Arts Council on the basis of performances they've done. So there is some flexibility, but today I'm going to focus on applications to the Arts Council. Next slide, please. So for global talent, the Arts Council are looking for individuals who are producing outstanding work within their field. It's for people who are regularly engaged within the last 5 years. So someone that has done a lot of work maybe a long time ago isn't going to be able to use this category. However, I think someone who's maybe not done a lot of professional work in the last 12 months during the pandemic, I would expect that the Arts Council would have some leeway for people who are not currently working regularly. There's no specific requirement for the type of music or the type of performances that are done. So I've had clients working with orchestras, with festivals, even doing music for video games. You're not limited to any specific type of musical performance. And there are two different categories or two different tracks. Exceptional promise for those who are maybe an earlier stage of their career and developing a track record, and exceptional talent, which is for people who already have a substantial track record within their field. Next slide. So a bit more information about the two tracks. So exceptional talent has the stricter criteria. So the things that you need to prove for exceptional talent are a little bit more difficult. But if you can meet these tougher rules, then the reward you get is that you're on a quicker route to settlement, so to your permanent stay in the UK. On the other hand, exceptional promise, the criteria are a little bit easier, but you are then on a 5-year route to settlement in the UK. The vast majority of applications made are in exceptional promise rather than talent. Next slide. So here I'm going to look at the evidence that you will need to meet the Arts Council criteria. So the Arts Council don't want to hear your music themselves. Well, they might do, but for the purpose of assessing the application, they're going to be looking at what other people have said about your work. So the first thing you need is reference letters. At least one can come from the UK, but it has to be 3 in total. They're also looking for media recognition, so reviews of performances, reviews of your work, awards, and just proof of performances that you've given. A lot of people ask me if you have to have awards, and a lot of people think that they're not eligible for the category because they haven't received an award. But you only need to have at least 2 of the following. So the vast majority of people that we see making these applications rely on having media recognition and having proof of the performances that they've done, and don't actually rely on awards. So awards are helpful, but it doesn't rule out making an application if you don't have any. Next slide. So some practical things to think about in making an application in this route is it's 2 stages. So first you make the application to the Arts Council, and then you make the application for the visa. The Arts Council can take, well, I think their website still says that they will take up to 8 weeks to make a decision, but we find that actually they're usually much quicker than this. I think they're the one place that during the pandemic have continued to make very prompt decisions when everyone else seems to be much slower. So you should allow up to 8 weeks, but in reality, you're likely to hear quicker. Some people can apply for the second stage, the visa application, from within the UK. But if you're here as a visitor, you are not normally allowed to apply for the second stage from within the UK. There are some specific rules in place at the moment because of COVID-19 that does allow some people to make that application from within the UK, but these are very time limited guidance documents, so they won't apply forever. However, for people who do need to leave the UK in order to apply, you don't need to necessarily go to your home country. You can apply from anywhere in the world. So I've had previously clients that have maybe had performances lined up in Europe somewhere, and rather than going back home, they've just made their visa application from France or Germany to make it a little bit easier for them and have less flights around the world. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of the fees for making this application, it is one of the cheapest fees for the Home Office for long-term routes. One of the really great things about this category is you can tell the Home Office how long you want to come for in 12-month blocks. So for example, if you know that you want to come to the UK to work on something specific for just a year, you apply for a year and the immigration health surcharge fee will just be £624. If you think you might want to stay longer, you can extend, but having that period allows you to essentially set the fees that you want to pay for the length of time that you want to come. Next slide. And the final thing that I wanted to say in this category is just about that level of flexibility that you have if you apply in this category. So you can work, you can be employed or self-employed. You don't need to have anything lined up in the UK at the time that you apply. It's something that helps, but it's not a requirement. So if you just know that there's likely to be opportunities here, you can apply on the basis of there being something that you want to do, not necessarily definitely going to do. You can also work for multiple different companies. You can set up your own company. You're not limited to working just within your field if you want to do other things as well. And one of the things that makes it really helpful is that you also don't have to work. So if you are someone who works on projects and might be, for example, very busy for a few months and then want to take a few months off, you have the flexibility to do that within this category. The only things to bear in mind is that if you do want to settle in the UK, so if you want to stay here on a long-term basis, you need to complete some work within your field that you can evidence to the Home Office at the time that you apply for your indefinite stay. And you need to have no more than 180 days outside of the UK in any 12-month period. But other than that, you have quite a lot of flexibility about what you do with your time in the UK. Next slide, please. These are just links to the various guidance documents that you will need in order to make the application. Next slide. So for skilled worker, this might be a route that someone comes in and intends to stay in, or it might be a route that someone would arrive in perhaps before they can meet the criteria for global talent, with the intention of switching to global talent later. There is a certain extent to which you can mix and match categories. This route replaced the old tier 2 category just at the very end of last year. And also I'll talk a little bit about the changes that were made when this route came in. Next slide, please. So this route, it's a sponsorship route. So that means that a company or organization will have a sponsor license, which is a kind of pre-approval from the Home Office that the employer can be trusted and allows them to sponsor employees. There's a lot more kind of very specific requirements in comparison to global talent. So there's a specific salary that must be earned, English language requirements, and less flexibility in terms of what you can do when you're here. So generally you're only going to be working for your sponsoring employer, although there are some exceptions to this. You can change employer throughout the period in the UK, but every time you want to change employer, you need to make a new application to the Home Office, so that can become quite burdensome. It's a 5-year route to settlement, so much like the exceptional promise route we discussed. Next slide. So as I said, so there are some mandatory parts to the application. So being sponsored, having a job offer that's appropriately skilled, and the English language requirement. And then there are some points that they call tradable. So there is a set salary for each job that can be sponsored, and a minimum salary level overall. But depending on the attributes of the individual, or sometimes the attributes of the job, you can apply on the basis of a lower salary. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in more detail. Next slide. So what this category has tried to do is make the process a bit more user-friendly, a bit more streamlined and quicker for individuals and employers. Because it's so new, I think it's a bit early to say whether this has been achieved or not yet. But one of the biggest changes is that there's no longer a resident labour market test. So the Home Office are no longer specifying specific recruitment processes that employers need to go through in order to sponsor their employees. The other thing that's quite useful is that there's no longer a cap on the number of people that can be sponsored. So in theory, this does make the process a little bit easier. Next slide. So here I've given an example which is hopefully relevant to you on what the Home Office are looking for when they're looking for that skilled job. So musician is an example of a skilled role, but musician can include essentially the jobs within that bullet point. The normal minimum salary that needs to be earned is £27,500. However, one of the tradable attributes is that some types of musician are on the shortage occupation list. So I've set out some detail there. Particular kinds of musician have these tradable points and can rely on a lower salary rate. Next slide, please. For companies in the UK that do want to bring individuals in to be sponsored, they have to get the sponsor license prior to sponsoring the individual. You can't do it all in one go. So you need to apply to the Home Office to prove really that you're a genuine business and that you are capable of sponsoring migrants in the UK. So this means that you have proper HR procedures in place, and that you have systems for keeping track of who you're sponsoring, when their visas come to an end, and important information. To make the application, you just need to send some documents to the Home Office. These are generally things that you would already have as a business. We sometimes find that documents are held by third parties, so some things will be held by your accountants, but generally they are things that you have, and it's a relatively straightforward process to prove to the Home Office that you are capable of carrying out these duties. The Home Office can visit you as part of the process. You can be interviewed, and you can also be audited during the validity of the license as well. So the Home Office can do a spot check on you and make sure that all your procedures are still in place. Next slide. So with skilled worker, there are various different fees that apply. Some of these can be passed on to the employee, but some of them must be paid by the employer. So it's really important that anyone speaks to the other half of that equation and make sure they know who is expected to pay what. Next slide. And again, these are just links to the various documents that will be useful for making an application, which hopefully you will have access to after the webinar. Next slide. And then the final category that I was going to discuss is just the temporary worker. Again, this is a replacement for an existing category or a previous category, the Tier 5 route. So anyone that sponsored someone with Tier 5 before, the rules are very similar. Next slide. So this is a sort of medium-term route. The big difference between skilled worker is that this one doesn't lead to settlement. So you can be granted permission for up to 12 months, depending on the length of the engagement that the person is coming for. Like skilled worker, you do need to be sponsored. So there needs to be a job lined up in the UK before you arrive. But unlike skilled worker, you can have a series of different engagements for different sponsors, and say, for example, if you're coming for a series of performances at different venues or run by different companies, you could have a series of sponsorship documents that all add together for the full period. So you don't need to come in and out for each different employer. You can be sponsored for the full period as long as there's no more than 14 days between each of the engagements. There's also a bit more flexibility on who can sponsor you. So sometimes agents or other individuals that don't have quite the same employer-employee relationship can do sponsorship in this category. For each job, there are codes of practice to follow in the recruitment process. Next slide. And again, just the fees for this category. They are a little bit cheaper overall, again, to reflect the fact that it's a shorter term route than the global talent and skilled worker. Next slide. And this should be the last one, and that has links to the relevant immigration rules and application forms and the codes of practice for recruitment that I mentioned. And next slide. And yeah, that's the last one. So that covers everything that I wanted to go through. I don't know if there's any questions for us.
Thank you both. Thank you very much. I think we had a couple of questions. Geraldine, you replied to one question, so thank you very much for that. There's one question from someone saying what method is used by the Home Office to know and check for how long they were outside the UK. Not sure if you can help with this.
Yeah, so the Home Office do keep records. So when you come in, you will normally be stamped, or if you're not stamped because you've used the e-gates, it should be recorded on the Home Office records. Their records are not entirely accurate. We do see when we do what's called a subject access request to the Home Office, they sometimes come back with inaccurate dates or incomplete dates more often, but they are theoretically keeping track who's coming in and out. And so, for example, for someone who's coming in often as a visitor, they may be stopped at the border and asked if they've been, or asked for their purpose and why they're traveling so frequently, so that it is on the records.
Super, great. We've got another question just come in for someone asking kind of what would be the process, or maybe what would be the best option for them if they were to come to work as a teacher.
Well, I think the same questions apply. How long are you going to come in for, or to undertake the teaching? Is it going to be paid? Then if it's more than 1 month, you're into the categories that Gillian spoke to. And if you're coming in frequently to teach someone, you'll have seen the issues that you may have to tackle there. But I can see if you have a group of students in the UK that need your particular expertise. And remember when we looked at what the permitted activities were and what kind of people that would be called creatives. So teaching a particular instrument or technique to a group of students in the UK, even if you're doing them frequently, if you have many students back in your home country, then frequent visits would make sense. It just has to make sense, really.
Yeah, and for someone coming as a more long-term route, a music teacher is a job that can be sponsored. There are different salary rates than the musician category that I put up before, but as long as the institution that you're teaching for has a sponsor license or is willing to get one, they can sponsor you in the same way that a musician could be sponsored.
Sure. There was another kind of question. Some musicians who are potentially like international renowned soloists, sometimes they might come to a university or conservatoire or anything like that to give a recital, but then follow on the next day, for example, to give a masterclass, so in kind of like a teaching capacity. Would that kind of fall into two different categories, or would it have to be specified in some way or anything like that? Sometimes it might be like a fee that involves both things, so for the recital and for the masterclass.
Well, there absolutely can be a mixture.
Right.
But again, we've seen the criteria for a short paid engagement.
Right, okay.
And therefore, one would need to focus on that because they're terribly concerned about people working here without permission.
Sure.
That's a major concern. So absolutely, there can be a mixture. And, you know, we also think that you might be pushing a bit on an open door with the government and creatives now, because there's such a fuss going on about the exchange of artists. And let's face it, after this year we've been through, the more the merrier, the more the better. So, but what one would need to focus on is the whole issue of paid employment. And I see that Steve Richards' question in the chat, that is a very, very cogent comment. And we've had that when we've given this talk previously, that sometimes rather than faff around with the permitted paid engagement visa, getting sponsorship in the ways that Gillian has suggested could well work better.
Sure, perfect, thank you. Do you happen to know if in the current circumstances a 1 month limit includes the compulsory 10-day quarantine, or is it 1 month from the end of quarantine?
That's difficult to say, and they're not saying, are they?
Yeah, as far as I know, they haven't changed the validity of a permitted paid engagement, and there's nothing on. The government has a page for COVID-related updates, which gets updated basically every day at the moment with different rules and how different people are affected. There is nothing on there that I can see that relates to permitted paid engagements. I think probably because there's so few of these happening at the moment. So yeah, I would assume, unless you're told otherwise, that it's for 1 month. But you should, when you come in at the border, you will be given a stamp that should have the period of validity on it. So you have to just follow what the stamp says in the passport.
And you make your case if you're making the application at the border. Mm-hmm. You make your case as strongly as you can for the practicalities.
Sure. The next question is might be a bit of a tangent, so I'm not sure if you can assist with this. It's to do with the EU settlement scheme. So someone who's holding a pre-settled status and have previously lived in the UK, have a flat in the UK, but they're not able to come back to the UK. Are they in any risk of losing the pre-settled status? I don't know if there's a limit on the validity of the settled status. Don't know if you can help with that or...
It isn't the only area we practice in, certainly with creative art. Now, you'll know that if you're outside the UK for more than 2 years, you will lose your pre-settled status.
Right. And
the other restrictions are about continuous residence. So if you're outside the UK, beyond permitted limits, you may not be able to tot up the time to obtain settled status. So having had pre-settled status, you don't lose that if you're outside the UK for less than 2 years.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, it seems that the questions have sort of stopped. If there's anything else, please let us know. Also, if you can think of any other questions following on from the webinar after the end of the webinar, you can send it to us. There will be our email addresses that will pop up at the end, and you can contact us at membership@ism.org, and we can get in touch with both Gillian and Geraldine and ask for their help. So thank you very much. Seems we don't have any more questions. Thank you again both for the presentation. It was really interesting and learned a lot. So thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at another webinar soon. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much for having us, and we're looking forward to you all working again as avid consumers.
Aren't we all? Yes, so are we. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Bye for now.
Bye.